After a monster start to the 2023 season, Jalen Hurts, A.J. Brown, and the Eagles fell apart in the second half of the year. The good news, we think they'll bounce back very quickly in 2024. We discuss the Eagles' 2024 fantasy outlook on today's episode of Locked On Fantasy Football.
You are Locked On Fantasy, your daily NFL fantasy podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks for making Locked On Fantasy Football your first listen every day. I'm one of your co-hosts, Michelle Magdziuk. When I'm not doing this, I'm a researcher and fantasy analyst with NFL Network.
And I'm your other co-host, Vinnie Iyer. When I'm not doing this, I'm writing about NFL, fantasy, and betting, and a lot more for sportingnews.com.
Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. We are continuing with our 32 teams. We are going through all 32 offenses and digging into their fantasy outlook for next year. Now we're moving on to the NFC East. We are starting today with the Philadelphia Eagles, who, man, did they fall apart at the end of last year. So they started on fire, right? Had a 10-1 record. They were looking like they were in 2022 when they went to the Super Bowl, but then they lost 5 of their last 6 games, got beat up against the Buccaneers in the wild card round, and they just didn't look like the same team. But still, throughout the year, they ranked 7th in points per game, 12th in fantasy points per game. Jalen Hurts was still the quarterback 2 in fantasy points per game, with Brown and Smith both top 22 wide receivers. The real only change-ups with this offense is they lost Jason Kelce, their Hall of Fame center, which is going to be maybe big in the running game. Switched out DeAndre Swift for Saquon Barkley, and then changed offensive coordinators, right? So now there's Kellen Moore there. It clearly didn't work for either of the coordinators on the Eagles last year. They moved on from both offensive and defensive coordinators after just one season. So let's dig into these Eagles players. Let's start at the top. Jalen Hurts, like I mentioned, wide receiver 2 last year, but it still was a down year compared to his quarterback 1 season in 2022, where he scored 24 points per game. So are you worried about the collapse of last year for Jalen Hurts?
No, not yet. I think what you need to see with the transition for Jalen Hurts is he might have to put the ball in the air a little bit more. We know Kellen Moore's offenses have led to some big numbers for Dak Prescott, very pass-heavy offense as well in his 1 season with the Chargers. So maybe Jalen Hurts has to say, look, it's not going to be about the tush-push anymore. Jason Kelce's not there. I'm not going to get those easy yards in the middle. We're breaking in a new interior offensive line. So he's got to, I think, evolve as a passer. They've taken care of what his wide receivers with some big contracts here. So they're locked into these guys in the pass game. I think Kellen Moore wants that there. He really has worked with some mobile quarterbacks, Prescott and Herbert. This is the first kind of pure running productive quarterback that he's had, but I think they'll incorporate multiple concepts here where, again, they'll get him comfortable to throw with a high volume and spread the ball around, and maybe curb the running a little bit. So maybe it's not that automatic. You're going to get a short touchdown from him every week. You'll still have him being effective running within the system here. So I think he's going to be pretty good. It's just going to be a different version of Jalen Hurts. Now, if the running goes away, do you get that level of 2022 production? You might not, but I think he's just good enough with the weapons he has to stay up there right behind Josh Allen, compete with Patrick Mahomes for the QB2 overall. So I'm not too worried. I just think you'll see a little bit of Jalen Hurts do things differently and also kind of evolve a little bit.
It would be nice to see him throw more passing touchdowns, right? So even if the rushing goes down a little bit, I still expect him to be a heavy rusher.
Yeah.
He has the most carries among all quarterbacks over the last 3 seasons. Like, that's still going to be there. That's part of his game. The rushing touchdowns, like 15 won't be there probably, right? Because that was a record among quarterbacks in a single season. It was weird that Hurts and Josh Allen both broke that last year at 15 each. But I mean, it's been 10, 13, 15. There's a good shot he's still going to score double-digit touchdowns, because why change something that works? I don't think Jason Kelce was everything with the tush push, right? Like, I think they can figure it out with a different center back there. Maybe it's not as effective where it happens like you get in like 100% of the time. It's still going to be a great play. And then Kellen Moore, like you mentioned, he has loved to pass, right? Even last year with the Chargers ranked 3rd in pass attempts at 632, and they didn't have Justin Herbert for a chunk there. I mean, their defense stunk, so they kind of had to throw. And then the Cowboys in 2021 with Kellen Moore ranked 6th, second in 2020. They were a bit lower in 2022, but Dak, dealt with that injury for handful of games there. But so I do expect Hurts's pass attempts to increase, and I think that'll kind of negate any rushing here that we see go down.
Yeah, the touchdowns are touchdowns. I mean, the one thing that you'll have to look at, so if scoring changes and you lose those 2 points for the passing touchdowns, you get 4 instead of 6, but you're still going to have pretty comparable totals with a few points here and there lost. But I think you want them to have 35 to 40 combined touchdowns. You don't really care how they come from. And then you want maybe a little bit more balance. I know it's a little bit harder to put up numbers in fantasy throwing than it is running. You have 25 yards versus 10 yards. So you got to do a little bit more, but then again, it's easier to pass downfield a little bit in today's NFL. So there's a lot of things you have to consider with Hurts, but you look at the touchdowns, I think they're also bound to go down because you have Saquon Barkley. We'll get into him as well. Somebody who can actually run the ball and pop in. We saw that just a couple of years with Miles Sanders. They didn't really have a lot of competition in the backfield, and Barkley, we know, is better than Sanders. So a lot of things to watch there, but again, the one thing I want to see is Hurts going to take off and run, or is he going to do the checkdowns? And running quarterbacks usually don't do this as much, but Barkley's a good receiver, and Moore wants to throw the ball a lot.
And I mean, really, he could use another weapon in the receiving game, right? He could use that check down. Now, sometimes he uses Dallas Goedert for that, but he could really use a more special talent that can do something after the catch with Barkley. Because after AJ Brown and DeVonta Smith, it's like they don't really have anything else, right? Now, that's one of the best duos in the league. So, like, you'll take that. I will say with Hurts, you get so much consistency with him in terms of fantasy. Even at the end of last year when the Eagles were struggling, like he still had a lot of great fantasy games. But I mean, in 9 of his 17 weeks for the fantasy season last year, he was a top 5 quarterback on the league. Then in addition to that, he had 2 more weeks as the quarterback 6 on the week. And then he had a week as quarterback 9, a week as quarterback 10, a week as quarterback 12. There's only 2 bad weeks of the season when he was quarterback 17 and quarterback 24. Like, he is very, very consistent. So with that consistency, do you think it's worth paying up that price? Because right now he's going as a quarterback 2 in drafts, 28th overall, only going behind Josh Allen, who's going about a round earlier than Jalen Hurts. But do you think Jalen Hurts is worth that price instead of taking, a top tier running back or wide receiver or tight end?
Well, I think you have to go with what you said. He's a safe pick, and sometimes we forget about that with these top quarterbacks. Mahomes might have a little bit of volatility, but I think Allen and Hurts have separated themselves because of the rushing and that touchdown potential. And we know they have big arms and they have good weapons. And particularly, you look at Hurts, he's got more established weapons. We just saw Josh Allen lost his 2 key targets from the last few years, Stephon Diggs and Gabe Davis. And he's breaking some new guys. But the Eagles have kind of been locked in with not only A.J. Brown and DeVonta Smith, but Dallas Goedert at tight end, and now you'll have Barkley catching passes as well. So I think as far as going safe, Allen Hurts are as safe as it gets across all positions.
Yeah, it is hard though when you look. Like, I know how safe Hurts is, but when you're looking like, okay, you have to take Hurts over a Travis Kelce or a Derrick Henry or even like a Brandon Ayuk, maybe if you're high on him, like that. Those are some tough players that have to take a quarterback over, especially when you're seeing, Dak Prescott go 62nd overall or Kyler Murray going 65th overall. Considering Dak's and Kyler's price, would you prefer to wait for them or just take Hurts and be like, okay, I have my guy the whole year. I don't have to worry about it.
Yeah, I think you also flip this conversation. Do you look at then running backs and wide receivers there in that Prescott range and where you're at there, where you take Jalen Hurts? So I think there are some things you're going to have to pass up on to get Jalen Hurts. That's just the reality of it. Like, he's a premium quarterback. I think Superflex, obviously, he goes right up there with Josh Allen 1-2 probably overall. So there's just something you have to weigh. I don't know if I would do it for like a Travis Kelce, but it might get harder if it's like a Marvin Harrison Jr., someone with some upside there that we're looking at instead of the quarterback. But again, the quarterback is the guy that you're looking at for the biggest source of points. If you can get those 25 to 30 points, depending on your system, every week, you're almost there because usually you're looking for 115, 120. So if you get a guy that gets you that, you're already starting with some house money ahead of everyone else at any other position.
Yeah, the more I dig into the Eagles, the more I'm getting excited again about Jalen Hurts. I thought I'd be a little bit lower on him this year, but no, he's still going to be my quarterback 2 in the ranks right behind Allen. And I think he's a fine pick that early if you want to just take your guy and have the consistent points in your quarterback position every single week. We're going to get into Jalen Hurts' weapons coming up in the next segment here. I mean, possibly the best wide receiver duo in the league. We'll discuss right after we hear from one of our sponsors. This episode of Locked On Fantasy Football is brought to you by the Game Time app. Buying tickets to your favorite events should not be stressful. Game Time is a fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater near you. With killer deals on last-minute tickets and their best price guarantee, you can stop stressing over the tickets and start getting hyped for the fun that you'll have. If there's ever a time you want to go to a baseball game this summer and you're like, shoot, I forgot to get tickets, or you're just hanging out and you're like, I feel like going to a baseball game, I'm telling you, just jump on the Game Time app. It's the fastest growing ticketing app in the country for a reason. You get images of your seat before you buy, so you know exactly what to expect when you arrive. Buy tickets in a matter of seconds, 2 taps, and you're set. And tickets are sent directly to your phone, so you never have to dig through your email. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. All you have to do is download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Again, that's code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off. Terms do apply. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. We're digging more into the Eagles 2024 fantasy outlook, and we're going to maybe the best wide receiver duo in the league with AJ Brown and DeVonta Smith. They're one of 3 teammate wide receivers last year that each had 1,000 receiving yards. That was with Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. And then also Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, which I was just shocked that Chris Godwin had 1,000 yards last year. Apparently 1,000 receiving yards isn't all that used to be cracked up to be. But let's start with AJ Brown because he's the wide receiver 1 in this offense, right? He finished as a wide receiver 11 in fantasy points per game, but that ended up being disappointing, right? Because the first half of the season, weeks 1 through 9, he was the wide receiver 2. Absolutely dominating. And then over the last half of the season, weeks 10 through 18, wide receiver 43 in fantasy points per game, just completely fell off the face of the earth. So where do you see AJ Brown this year? Going back to what he did in 2022 and first half of 2023, or still struggling this upcoming year?
Yeah, what I like about AJ Brown and DeVonta Smith and their floor is the fact that there's not a lot to go around here. They still didn't really upgrade too much at the other wide receiver spot. Dallas Goedert just kind of fading a little bit as well, tight end, and he just kind of picks his spots to have some yardage and reception games of high volume. So you look at AJ Brown, he has that chemistry with Jalen Hurts. He can be a little bit big game dependent. We've seen that, right? Where he erupts, he's the matchup, and they keep going to him over and over again. And then you have the inconsistency. So last year wasn't as much game to game, but it was more early part of the season to late part of the season. And there are games where he's going to disappear because he's a little bit of a big play guy and a touchdown guy. And the Eagles are great at scheming all that open. I think he'll be helped by Kellen Moore's offense, where they're looking for downfield throws and trying to open things up here for AJ Brown. So I think he'll be okay. I think he's going to probably finish higher than wide receiver 11 this year in terms of average scoring. I think he's just too good, and he's gotten paid, so that part is not on his shoulder here, worrying about that. Again, this should be pass happier, so more targets should come Brown's way here. I think that's about right. He's wide receiver 7 now on the board. I think that's where you have to look at him. I mean, I think he's more like that receiver we saw earlier in the season there. But again, he can be a little streaky. You're going to have to accept some lower games from him based on the matchups. But I think this Moore system is really good for AJ Brown.
So we know these wide receivers across the league. Some of them, are a bit of a diva, right? That's just a position where they are. And I feel like that was a lot of AJ Brown's struggles last year. Like, he was just mad. Like, he just was angry. He didn't want to be there. Well, I'm making this up, right? I don't know if this is really what he was thinking, but looking at him, watching his body language, he just seemed annoyed to be playing on this team. Like, but then, they changed their coordinators. You would think that would have been the issue, right? And then they also gave AJ Brown a 3-year, $96 million extension. At the time, it was first among wide receivers, but now we've had a couple. Now we had Justin Jefferson take over that. But like, I think he'll be happy. No, again, this year, like if he likes Kellen Moore, him and Jalen Hurts are buddies, and he got paid again. Like I feel like he'll feel respected and be out there. He does have the third most receiving yards in the league over the last 2 years, behind only Tyreek Hill and CeeDee Lamb. So I do think wide receiver 7, 10th overall, like that's a pretty fair price for him. This is my main question for you, right? It's AJ Brown or Marvin Harrison Jr. Which one would you go with?
That's a tough one. I think I would go. I think I go AJ Brown, just barely above Marvin Harrison Jr. I think it's a toss up here. I think you just have, if you're going for more volume and targets and you lean in the PPR direction, I think you might have to go with Harrison. But if you're standard even half, I think you go with AJ Brown.
I think these two guys kind of remind me of each other a lot at different positions. Jahmyr Gibbs. Are you going to take your running back 1 at the end of the first round, Jahmyr Gibbs, or AJ Brown at the end of round 1 for wide receiver 1?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I go AJ Brown there. I mean, Jahmyr Gibbs is still splitting a little bit, and AJ Brown, I know, is splitting the key targets with DeVonta Smith, but it's also harder to get the receiver of AJ Brown's caliber a little bit later.
True. Now, DeVonta Smith, he's kind of stuck in that kind of boring fantasy area for wide receivers. He was a wide receiver 22 last year in fantasy points per game, actually even worse than what he was in 2022. He was a wide receiver 16 in 2022 in points per game. It's just not a lot of big games there, right? Because AJ Brown is a wide receiver 1 and they don't throw all that often. Maybe with Kellen Moore, they'll throw more this year, but he just doesn't have the opportunity to have those huge, massive games. He had 1 game as a top 5 wide receiver last year, only a couple other handful, or 2 other games, I should say, in the top 10, a lot in the 20s, 30s, some in the 40s. So what are your thoughts on DeVonta Smith? Is he ever going to be able to have that top 12, even top 15 wide receiver upside?
I mean, the way they run their offense, I mean, it's different again. I mean, we've basically had 3 different offenses in 3 years, from Shane Steichen to Brian Johnson. Now what we have with Moore, that, again, these variables are what are in play. But, again, DeVonta Smith is never necessarily going to get the high leverage targets that A.J. Brown gets. So that's always there. I think DeVonta Smith was the alpha. You'd be all in on him. But he's a very good complementary receiver. He enjoys doing that. Again, I think if you want just a solid wide receiver 2, sometimes he can go off, but most of the times he'll be steady here. That's where you go with DeVonta Smith. And right now, wide receiver 23, right about where he was scoring, that's a very good value for him from last year, because I think he can be closer to the wide receiver 16. He's really good. He also got paid here, so it should be a lot of fun to see these 2 guys go to work together this season.
Yeah, it is interesting because his targets are going to have to increase, right? 112 targets last year. 12 of the top 15 wide receivers in fantasy points last season had at least 136 targets. The 3 that didn't were Nico Collins. He averaged 16 yards per reception. Brandon Ayuk led the league in yards per reception at 18. And then Deebo Samuel, who we know it's like the rushing, right? The rushing yards, the rushing touchdowns. That's what allowed him to do that. So if DeVonta Smith is going to be a top 15 wide receiver, either he's going to need to get a good another 25 targets added to his list, or added to what he had last year, or his efficiency has to be one of the best in the league. I think that's the only route for him. So that's a little bit more difficult, but he is going wide receiver 23, 37th overall. When looking at the guys around him, I do think maybe it's still a little too high. So going back to back at wide receiver 23 to 24, it's DeVonta Smith and Malik Neighbors, who we'll be talking about on our next show when we cover the Giants. Which one would you rather have, Smith or Neighbors?
I think I go Neighbors because I know he's going to be clear number 1, and I know where his targets are going to be. So there's that. I mean, you got to balance that out. You want the favorable coverage for your guy that's going to be number 1, and it's helpful to have a really good number 2. But now we're talking about DeVonta Smith there as the number 2 versus Neighbors being the clear number 1 with the Giants.
Let's talk about 2 wide receivers too then for their team. Would you rather DeVonta Smith at 37th overall or get T. Higgins at 54th overall?
I think I would go with T. Higgins. He's just the better value. He's a guy that I think can score more touchdowns. So, yeah, I mean, that's the first, I think, real good vibe I have on Higgins versus another player. But, yeah, I just like his touchdown ability a little bit more than Smith.
So it does seem like Smith probably needs to be pushed on a little bit more for either of
Yeah.
us to consider him on our team. It's not like we're saying he's a bad pick, just not one. I just
He's
like the other
solid,
people
but not
on the team.
necessarily spectacular. I think that's how you look at it. And that's
Yes.
what you got to expect out of him as a wide receiver, too. Now, we'll see if Saquon can be spectacular. He's going to be lead back now in Philadelphia. We tell you if his arrow is pointing up from his now rival Giants here in 2024. All right. We talked about how the finals are set in the NBA and the NHL. You've got the Mavericks and the Celtics. You've got the Oilers and the Panthers. So a lot of good stuff coming up here. And you can get in on the action and win a big trophy of your own. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL. FanDuel's giving you a chance to bring home that victory. Right now, new customers to FanDuel get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. There's plenty to go around with those series: Dallas, Boston, Edmonton, Florida. Plenty of players that you can look at and really get in on the double action of hardwood and hoops. Just visit FanDuel.com and /locked-on and make every playoff shot count for you. That's FanDuel.com/locked-on. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, Michelle, it is time to close the show. And one big fantasy asset arrived in the offseason. Saquon Barkley leaves the Giants for the Eagles, so he'll get a couple chances to play his old team. Now I'm feeling it. I think Saquon, he's got the right team here. I think you have to say his arrow's pointing up with this running game.
See, this is what's hard for me. So he was running back 9 in points per game last year, running back 5 in 2022. Like, he's been a good player. Now he's up and down. He's pretty much up and down in any given play of any given game, but also
Yeah.
in any given week. Like, he's always been an inconsistent type of player like that. But he does offer that upside, and he is in a better offense for sure. But like over the last 2 years, he's seen the 4th most touches among running backs. He has the 4th most rushing yards, the 5th most scrimmage yards among running backs, 6th most scrimmage touchdowns. I think in the situation he was with the Giants, he was the entire team. And now I don't see that with the Eagles, right? And also, my biggest concern with Saquon is he going to be vultured from the touchdowns from Hurts, because Hurts is going to get his rushing touchdowns? And then also, like you mentioned in the section with Hurts, will he check down to Saquon Barkley? Because he has not done that. Hurts has targeted his running backs in just 14% of pass attempts over the last 2 years. That's the 4th lowest among qualified quarterbacks over that span. To compare, Daniel Jones targeted running backs on 21% of his pass attempts, which was 4th highest. So a good 7% higher of pass attempts. That's a huge chunk of a difference there. That's maybe Hurts with Saquon Barkley now checks down, but that's what worries me with Barkley, is the vultured with the touchdowns and not getting those checkdowns.
Yeah, I mean, you got to figure out, what are they going to do? Are they going to do things that Hurts has done in the past? Are they going to do things that Barkley's done in the past? They do have an offense here with more. So is that the way they approach their backfield? I don't think, if you're Howie Roseman and this team, that you go out and get Saquon Barkley when you've been doing fine with these other plug-in guys, unless you have a specific plan for him. And I think the offense is changing. I mean, keep in mind, you had Kellen Moore really helped with Tony Pollard and Austin Eckler as those kind of explosive backs there that you could work in the passing game at times. Here, I know Eckler was slowing down, but Pollard certainly was explosive in his system just a couple years ago. So when I look at Barkley, again, his path might be a little bit different. I could see him getting more TDs. I think he's just a guy that's going to kind of play off what you get in this running game and the passing game with Hurts. So a lot of opportunities to score are going to be there that the Giants did not give him. So he could have inconsistent rate scoring touchdowns, but there's just going to be more scoring for him. And I think they'll incorporate Barkley as a receiver. Keep in mind, there's not a lot behind Brown and Smith here. Dallas Goedert, but receiving core wasn't all that upgraded. So there's some targets to go around for Barkley. Not saying that he's going to get the Giants check down volume, but I think that's going to be an adjustment the Eagles make, is like, don't always force it downfield. Barkley is a very good receiver and can do that. I also think Barkley's motivated to maybe prove the Giants wrong a little bit. He had a good run there, but always couldn't stay healthy. Now I think he's going to be pressing to say, look, this is what you could have still had with one more year. And I think he's that type of player, right? He's got a bit of an ego. He wants to kind of brush people aside who doubt him. So this is going to help Barkley as a sneaky way to increase his production here in 2024, I should say.
I think my biggest issue with Barkley is just his cost. Running back 6, it's too high for me. With the uncertainties with changing teams, he was a top 5 running back in just 3 weeks of the fantasy season last year, top 10 in just 4 weeks, and now he's going as RB6 just because he changed teams. I'm not. It's just too high. Like, he's going back to back with Jonathan Taylor. I would much prefer Jonathan Taylor.
Oh yeah.
Would you like Taylor or Barkley if you had to pick?
I would go Jonathan Taylor. I mean, Barkley, again, a little bit older. Again, a few more variables than Taylor. I know where I'm at with him and Shane Steichen.
I would also go Barkley. I would also go Kyren Williams over Barkley. I know I'm higher on Kyren Williams than you, but which way would you go, Barkley or Kyren Williams? They're going 14th overall for Barkley, 18th overall for Williams.
Yeah, I think I would like Barkley even with that kind of slight difference because I think he's going to be involved in the passing game a little bit more. Kyren Williams really didn't do that with part of his game, and I think Barkley is going to kind of say, I want to be rejuvenated and stay on the field here, where I think Kyren Williams could break down.
You know who doesn't vulture touchdowns? Matthew Stafford. So I'm going to go with Kyren Williams because he's going to get way more touchdowns than Barkley, in my opinion. And then, so talk about changing teams, being older, being really good for fantasy. Like, Derrick Henry is going 32nd overall, while Barkley's going 14th overall. I just can't see a reason why to reach on Barkley when you can just get Derrick Henry 2 rounds later.
Yeah, I think the receiving is definitely a factor. I mean, I think they want to incorporate this, and this is just my feeling here on why they would sign him and splurge, because the Eagles usually don't do this. We've seen them just get by with other backs here, so I think they wanted a little bit multi-purpose guy that is not going to telegraph if it's a run.
Swift, and he didn't get the targets. Like, Swift is known to be a receiving back. He's not even.
Well, I know, but that was a different offense, and I think that was maybe a shortcoming that they're going to try to fix. Right? They didn't like that. Maybe they said, "Why did we get this guy if we're not going to use him in that capacity?" Right? So I think you just have to think. Like, it's a lot of radical change for a team that's really good offensively with a lot of skilled players, some offensive line changing, some coaching staff changing. So I don't know. Sometimes you follow the money, and sometimes it works. But sometimes that player lets down, and they try to fit a square peg in a round hole, and then you get bad results. So Kellen Moore, I'm hoping, again, Kellen Moore kind of does a smart thing, preserves Hurts' body a little bit, lets Barkley run in high leverage situations, and realize, again, you don't always have to force it downfield. You can check it down to Barkley.
Yeah. Is there any interest in Dallas Goedert late in drafts? He's going as a tight end 13th, 113th overall. He's always like the third option on this team, which is fine for a tight end. He gets his receptions, some receiving yards here and there, but like, the touchdowns has been his biggest downfall in his career. He's never had more than 5 in a season, and that was in 2019. Last 4 years, 3 touchdowns, 4 touchdowns, 3. Like, for him to make any impact as a fantasy tight end this year, he's going to have an outlier touchdown year for his career. Maybe it could happen, but I don't really want to bet on that.
Yeah, the thing is, they don't also use him that much in the red zone. I mean, they use him more to like go down the seam and stretch the field. I mean, this guy probably has a better shot at getting a 80 to 100-yard game than he does in getting the end zone in a lot of cases, because the way they deploy him, he's a kind of a downfield tight end. So, yeah, I'm not interested. And keep in mind, we were talking about TJ Hawkinson when we were breaking out the Vikings. He's being taken here. I mean, you can get a lot more upside with Hawkinson stream. Maybe you do a double dip here and go Goddard to cover yourself early, and then come back around, take another tight end and go Hawkinson. So you got that position set here for early and throughout the rest of the season here. But Dallas Goedert, again, he's a little flashy. You got to wait. Then he kind of catches up, right? He kind of can have multiple shaky games in a row. Then he can go like 7 for 120. And all of a sudden he's made up for 2 games that were clunkers, and his numbers look better than they are. So I think we finally adjusted his numbers to where they are. But that said, I can't say I'm interested too much in Dallas Goedert.
No, if I'm going to wait that long for a tight end, I'm just going to take a shot on Pat Freiermuth or Juwan Johnson. They just keep waiting. But either one of those two, Goddard, we know what he is. And again, he could have the crazy outlier touchdown year with 10 touchdowns, but historically in his career, like it just seems like that's not going to happen. That is it for today's show. Thank you to you all for making Locked On Fantasy Football your first listen every day. Every day, Vinnie and I will be back. We'll be posting our next episode on Thursday. We're going to be covering the New York Giants. Don't miss it. Bye, y'all.